Welcome to the Being Known podcast with my friend, Dr. Curt Thompson.
My friend, Pepper Sweeney.
We are here to discover and explore what it means to be truly known. And we are here in season 3 of the Being Known podcast, where we are going through Dr. Desire's new book, Soul of Desire, Discovering the Neuroscience of Longing, Beauty, and Community. And we started this season 3 talking about how we are a people of longing, a people of desire. And we are fast forwarding to today, where we are talking about how we are a people of grief. This chapter, Curt, was just packed full of just great stuff. Really, grief is obviously and trauma, as we're going to be talking about, are deep and serious and sometimes sad and hard subjects to talk about. But I love the way you handle it in this chapter. I really like to take notes and underline things that stand out to me in books. And I have to say that I went back to relook at the chapter to start, thinking about what we wanted to highlight today in the show. And the problem is I've underlined everything in the chapter. Like, I literally have pages where the whole page is underlined. It's like, that's not very helpful to go back to that. But it is a testament to your writing and to how much I'm getting out of the book. So thank you for that. You start this chapter talking about a story, and the Tara story, obviously not her real name, but can you share a little bit of that story? I think it's a good place for us to start today.
Yeah. Tara's life was one that in many respects was, as we've come out of the chapter before, we've come out of talking about that we are people who are longing to be known in order to create beauty. We're looking for beauty everywhere. And in many respects, there were many elements of Tara's life that were reflective of beauty. I mean, many elements of it when she walked into my office. The critical elements of her story begin when she was a teenager, and she had been part of a church in which her youth pastor had taken advantage of her sexually. And of course, this is not an uncommon phenomenon. I wish we could say that this is a rare event. But it's not an uncommon thing for people who are in the business of doing the work of intimacy. I mean, this is the business of the church. This is what it means to care for people's souls. And so we naturally and commonly become connected to people in deep and lasting and meaningful ways, all for the purpose of good things. But as we've said, evil's mission is to be parasitic on those missions for goodness and beauty, and that's what was happening here. And so this youth pastor took advantage of her, and as it turned out, others sexually, but it didn't come out at the time. It wasn't until she had real challenges when she was in college, and she eventually started to see a counselor and worked really hard with that counselor. But in the course of this time, all the stories came out about her experience having been in high school. There was a lot of work that was done in and around all that. The youth pastor themselves was summarily dismissed from the church, and the church itself, from what I could understand from her story, it wasn't in our part of the country. It was at a different part of the country, but where the church had really done a lot of work to try to do right by these families and these children, these women, young women who had been taken advantage of. What brought Tara into my office, however, she was now married with 3 kids. Later in her 20s, she met her husband, and they had worked really hard. She made him aware of what she was in the middle of. And he had also mentioned to her that earlier in his life, in his early 20s, he'd had a real challenge with pornography, but he had done a lot of work with this. And by the time they got married, they were both positioned toward marriage, coming from places of healing from all this trauma and all this grief that had taken place. But what brought her into my office, she was now in her 30s. They'd been married for a number of years and they had 3 kids. And what brought her into my office was that 2 things happened. One was that her husband had some real challenges and had fallen back into the use of pornography and had even solicited sex. And of course, we don't have words for that, but he, what he was really trying to do is trying to work this out. He wanted to come clean. He wanted to do the work. He knew that this was challenging. He wanted to. What was really painful was that around the same time, she heard from a friend that this former youth pastor had somehow managed to make his way into a different city and into a different church congregation where, as a pastor of some kind in that church congregation, he once again had been found to be and was accused of sexual manipulation and abuse of people in the congregation. And so, again, I don't have words for this. And, this day we are recording on this Friday, the day after we've gotten news of these explosions in Kabul and how many have been killed and casualties and so forth and so on. And we think of those kinds of scenarios. We think of scenarios of war, and death and grief is in some respects to be expected, although never any easier, or is it ever good. But we don't expect this in the church. The church is not the place where we expect this kind of trauma and this kind of grief. I mean, the church, if we accept the notion that it's a hospital, at one level, we would like to believe that it's not really all that surprising that there are so many people who are so sick. Right. And that we're just casualties that are there, and we're all trying to become well. But what we're not anticipating is for any of the doctors to take advantage of the patients. Right. And we don't really, and so the work that I began to do with Tara eventually led toward her, as we will talk about in later episodes, talked about her becoming part of one of these confessional communities. But I have to say, Pepper, even as I'm sitting with her, as I'm hearing these words, it's kind of like, if I mean, this might be overdoing it, but if we as caregivers if we allow ourselves to imagine us being lifeguards at the beach and somebody's drowning, and we want to be present with them to be helpful, but then we ourselves are just overwhelmed by the very same waves. I mean, that's kind of what it felt like. Not that I was being, but at the time, I felt it in my chest. I felt it in my whole body. How am I going to be helpful? And of course, this is what evil would love for us to believe, that things are so bad that nothing can be done. And of course, this is pretty much where Tara found herself, in this place of grief, of loss, of trauma. And we talk about these kinds of stories, and one of the things that we are tempted to do in response to hearing stories like this is we are tempted to imagine that unless my story is like that unto Tara's, then what do I have to complain about? What do I have to talk about? What grief do I have to describe? And we're going to talk a little bit more about the mechanics of grief and loss here in just a moment. But I think that right off, most of us are not having most of our days shattered by the kinds of stories that we just heard about with Tara. Now, many of us who are listening have stories that are just like this or worse in some way, shape, or form. It can come in many, many hues and shapes and sizes and colors. For those of us who can't right now access a story like Tara's, what I want us to be aware of, though, is that because we don't, then we think that our grief and our loss and our trauma isn't really that big of a deal. Because how could I complain about my loss when there are the Taras in the world?
Right. We have a tendency to minimize our own grief because we empathize, sympathize with larger things like this that happen to somebody. And you're almost embarrassed to bring up your own issues.
Right. It brings us to this notion of like, well, we lose things all the time, but what is it about loss that's, just losing? What makes something like grief stricken about a loss? And what is it? And does it have to be earth shattering in order for it to be grief stricken? And the answer is actually no. We like to talk about grief as the thing that we start to feel. And of course, with, Kubler-Ross's work around grief and loss and death and all dying and all the kinds of things, like what does it mean for us to lose things in this process? And there's this stage of shock and of anger and of bargaining and of like reimagining and then reconciliation that come out of that. But one of the ways that we talk about it in a fairly succinct way is that I'm going to experience grief anytime I experience the loss of something to which I have a fairly significant emotional attachment. In the book, I tell this story of like I like fountain pens, and I got introduced to these a number of years ago, and I have 4 or 5 of these fountain pens, and I don't spend as much money as one could spend. Like you can go in the catalog and find
that's
like,
crazy.
dude, like you could buy a car for what you could spend now.
Right.
Maybe not a Tesla, but you could buy a car for some of the money that you would spend on some of these pens. It wasn't that kind of money, but I love what a fountain pen feels like in my hand and as it hits the paper and all the things. And I lost one of these pens. And like, you'd think I'd lost a child.
Yeah.
In terms of what was going on internally for me. Now, of course, I'm aware enough to know that I'm not going to say this to anybody because I don't want anybody to think like, Curt, it's just a pen. Like it's just a pen.
But we are recording, that, right? and you've also written about it in your book. So the cat's out of the bag.
What's wrong with me?
Right.
I wasn't supposed to mention this.
I appreciate you mentioning it though, because it does help put things in perspective. So continue with continue with the story.
Well, I think it highlights that like, well, it's just a pen, but for me, as I do write about in the book, for me, that pen is associated with particular work that I do. Like in my journal, I only use a fountain pen to write my journal. There's something about the connection to the paper and the instrument and so forth, that it's not just the words that you write. It's not just the process that's going on in your head. It's the whole endeavor. In that I believe that the work of doing the work in my journal is work that God is trying to construct. It's an artistic endeavor.
Yeah. In the attachment that you have to it is where the grief comes in. Like, so 2 days ago, I accidentally left my AirPod Pros in my pocket and washed my pants. Okay. So I'm
not
looking,
alone.
right.
I'm not alone.
Now I'm not attached. I'm attached to the $200 I got to spend to go buy a new pair, but I'm not really, I use them every day, all day long, like you do, obviously.
Yeah.
And it was like, but that wasn't grief.
Mm-hmm.
A friend years ago gave me one of his pipes. Right. And he has since passed away. This was, I loved this pipe. I just was, meant so much to me. And then, with a pipe, like you with the pen and the paper, you pack the pipe, there's a whole ritual about it and all that. And I'm thinking about my friend when I'm doing it, and I lost the pipe. And that was very similar, I'm sure, to the feeling that you had when you lost the pen. And it's all about attachment, right?
Right.
It's all
Right.
about, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, we like to talk about this notion that when I lose a thing to which I have this emotional connection, right, that connects me to people, right? The pipe isn't just a pipe; it is a conduit to your friend.
Yes.
And like my pen is a conduit to so many things in my journal, but that have emerged, like, you and I have a conversation and the next day I'm writing about it in my journal, or I meet with my spiritual director and I'm writing about it in my journal. It is a conduit to people.
Yeah.
And so in this way, you lose it and it's like somebody's just like, you know, pulled my forefinger out of my hand, and with no anesthesia, it just goes.
Right.
And I want us all to be aware that what's significant about this is that we often grow up in systems, in families, in which our attachment patterns are such that the beauty that we've talked about so far, that we long to create, that begins in the creation of relationships, and that extends into enabling and encouraging those relational experiences, to prompt and encourage each of those children in our homes, or the employees in our businesses, or the students in our classroom, or the members of the orchestra that we're conducting, or whatever it is that we're doing, that we're in charge of, that we are encouraging them to also be agents of creation of beauty and goodness. All of that work that we do, we often aren't paying attention to the role that attachment plays. And so when we lose things that we don't even know that they represent such important things, then we have this feeling of why am I feeling what I feel? It's a pen, for crying out loud. I mean, I did have that feeling, like I'm aware that I'm missing the pen, like what the heck? Why? What? And you're like, oh, because this is you feeling like you're losing a part of Pepper, losing a part of David, losing a part of this group of men that I'm part of, losing part of my wife, right? I'm having this felt sense of loss of connection of relationship. And, in Tara's situation, one of the things that the trauma really revealed was not just this notion of the loss that she experienced of her innocence and of her being protected in the church and so forth and so on, but this wasn't a one-time event. This was something that went on over a period of time. And one wonders, how is it that Tara didn't immediately, the first time that something was going on, how was it that Tara didn't immediately go to her father and say, Dad, something happened today with this guy, and I'm not okay? And how is it that the dad doesn't know immediately, and the dad doesn't do what fathers do? Now, this is not throwing Tara under the bus or throwing her father under the bus, but the reality is that Tara had actually lost something from her father that she didn't know that she'd even lost. This is what happens in insecure attachment. We're losing things in those attachment processes that we don't even know, and we don't sense, we're not aware of the loss until later, when something happens that reveals that, oh, I lost something. I didn't receive something that I should have received. I remember, my father died when I was 17. And my attachment pattern was such that, I remember the day that he died, that Monday morning that he died, 9:00 in the morning. We're sitting in the hospital waiting room, and the physician, the internist, comes out and informs us. And I'm just aware that everybody else in the room is really, really, really upset, but I'm aware enough to know that everybody's upset, and I'm aware that I'm not. But I'm also observing this and aware that I'm not quite sure what's happening here.
Right.
And that was true for a long time. And then I graduated from high school, and my graduation, this thing just blindsided me.
Because he wasn't there.
He wasn't there.
Yeah.
And then I get married, and he's not there. I have my first child. And then we have a son whose middle name is given for him. And grief circles back around, and you discover I lost something I didn't even know I lost. And there were things that were taking place in Tara's life of loss that happened even before all the carnage. And so we sometimes lose things sequentially. But the challenge still is, are we actually paying attention to it in such a way that we can then name it so that Jesus can meet us even in the slightest places, so that we're not comparing our losses to anyone else? That's a danger. The minute I start comparing my losses to the families who've just lost their sons in Kabul, the minute I start to do that and minimize my losses, my griefs, I begin to practice not paying attention to them. And then they're going to find me and overwhelm me because I've not had much practice knowing what to do with them. We were getting ready. You were mentioning a story of your own.
Yeah.
I'd love for folks to hear.
Yeah. I've shared on this podcast that, my early career was as an actor in Los Angeles, and pursuing big dreams and reaching many of them, and having a lot of successes, and then sort of as I got older and my career started to change, Hollywood is a city of youth, and the roles start to.
I don't know why you're not still there, bro.
Right, exactly. The roles are start to diminish as you get a little older. If you haven't reached a certain, even if you have, they start to diminish, and for women it's 10 times worse. Let's just acknowledge that it just is. But the thing about Hollywood is, a friend of mine used to say, Hollywood is like a gold mining town, right? You're either an inch away from a major strike, or you're a mile and a half away from $1.95, and it's almost impossible to tell the difference. I mean, so you're holding on to this hope, right? And everything can change with one phone call.
Yeah.
Like, for all of us, everything can change with one phone call, but it's usually that usually means that something bad happened, right? But like when you're in that world, everything can change for the better with one call, and so having that sort of hope to hold on to. And so when we were getting ready to move out of state and back here to Kentucky, which I'm so thrilled that we have, I love it here, and it's all good. I had felt like, even building up to that time, that we made this move because I had let go of some of those dreams. I had let go of those things. But when we got back here, I found myself grieving. And it kind of hit me out of nowhere, because I thought that I had, let go,
you planned.
Yeah.
You could see what you were doing.
Exactly. Yeah. And yet, it was like, okay, you've really got to let go of these dreams, because, you're not in Kansas anymore, or you're not in Hollywood anymore. And so it was kind of a difficult time for me,
right,
grieving that loss.
Right. Well, and that story, Pepper, really highlights for me this sense of even when we do all of our homework ahead of time, like we're going to make the decision. Yeah, I realize what I'm giving up. I'm going to leave. I'm going to go do that. And then the grief finds you in ways that you just don't see coming. Like, I thought I was prepared for this, or I thought I'd taken care of this business. One of the things that happens for us is, I think about, I may have told this story before about, this event that happened between me and my son, Nathan, where, I misbehaved as a father when he was in college, and we had to work through this rupture. And, it took me 6 months. Like, my grief, it wasn't enough for me to say how sorry I was, it wasn't enough for me. I mean, he was in the process of forgiving me right away. But even so, it took me months because I would tell him how sorry I was, and he would say, "It's okay. I've forgiven you. We're gonna work through this." And 2 weeks later, it's just back in my head, and I can't. It just comes back over and over and over again. And this is what evil, of course, wants to do. Wants to compound grief. And like in Tara's story, she got set up for things, not intentionally, not consciously, but she was set up to have these kinds of things happen to her. And her grief at what happened to her was then compounded and made more complex by the grief of discovering that she hadn't been protected, not just in that moment, but even before then. And we come to discover that when we lose things like pens, that if there's any other grief that has not been resolved, our griefs start to call to one another. The grief that I'm experiencing today, the grief that I experienced 3 years ago, but that I didn't resolve, is being echoed. It's hearing its voice being called through the halls of my soul. And it comes running. And I wonder, why am I so upset about a pen? Because as it turns out, it's not just about relationships. It's also not just about a pen.
Right.
It's about other things, perhaps, for us that have been precious that we've lost, that we haven't been able to retrieve. It calls to all kinds of things. And this is why when we talk about trauma and how trauma really kind of is this event, I think it's important for us to talk about, like, how do we define it? How do we talk about, how do we get our hands around it? That's important because we like to talk about trauma being something that shatters the lens through which we see our life. And that shattering can be like it was for Tara, but the shattering can be in what I might call, micro moments, small moments. I tell folks, look, if you were to bruise your forearm, because you hit it on a door jamb going through or whatever, it's a small bruise. You don't really notice it. It's not that big of a deal. And if you see it a day or two later, you're like, oh yeah, I remember. You barely remember how it got there. But if you were to take a microscope, not even an electron microscope, if you were to take a regular microscope, and if you were to carve out the tissue that's just underneath the bruise and put it under the microscope under a slide, and you were to look at it, carnage is all you would see. Now, the reason that we don't think twice about it is because there's enough healthy tissue around it to buffer it and to bring healing. But it doesn't change the fact that even the smallest of bruises leaves carnage in its wake. And so we discover that trauma does tend to shatter things. The real question has to do with the two features that make traumatic events eventually become what we experience to be traumatic experiences for us. For one to say, I have been traumatized, is different than saying I experienced a traumatic event. Two people can be in the same automobile, experience the same car accident, and one be traumatized and the other not be. What do we mean by that? We mean that for a trauma to be traumatizing, we would suggest that there are two things that are necessary. The first is that the person perceives, and this is really important, our perception is that I'm overwhelmed by the event. The event itself is overwhelming. It overwhelms my capacity to sense, image, feel, and think in a coherent fashion. I'm overwhelmed. That's my initial response, that I'm overwhelmed. And the second is that I have no agency. I am unable to do anything about the felt sense of overwhelmed. If I'm overwhelmed by the bookshelves that have fallen away from the wall and landed on me, this happened to our daughter. She's had a set of lockers that landed on her when she was in elementary school. But if I can yell to somebody down the hall and they come and they pick up the lockers, it is a traumatic event, but it's not traumatizing because I have agency to do something about this. This is true for all kinds of things that we experience. And so when we find ourselves in any kind of event in which we are able to escape the event, in which we are able to find access to agency that can keep me back within my window of tolerance that we've talked a little bit about in the past. That capacity to shift back into the window of tolerance means that I'm not traumatized by the event. But for many of us, we have found even the smallest of moments to be overwhelmed. So for instance, we wouldn't think that a child being yelled at by their father or mother in public would necessarily be traumatizing. We would say like, oh, that's, unfortunately, like Sarah's dad he's just a hard guy. But if you were to ask Sarah, her 6-year-old self or her 14-year-old self, what was that like? We might discover that her emotional sense in that moment was that she was overwhelmed. And of course, she was able to tolerate it, right? It didn't kill her. But she didn't have agency to do anything that would bring her back into her window of tolerance. And so she learns then to live outside the window of tolerance. She learns to live in this constant undercurrent state of fight or flight whenever she's got to talk to her dad. And this trauma, this way of acting in this way, it tends to shatter us. Now, trauma can happen in one of two ways that we talk about. The first form, trauma A, is what happens when we don't receive what we need to receive. This is the trauma of neglect. This is the trauma of being ignored. This is the trauma of not having my social engagement system activated. This is the trauma of what happens when, in Tara's case, her father was not coming to find her on a regular basis before any and all of this started. Her father, who's not a bad guy, but because of his own story, he wasn't able to come to find her in ways that would enable her to be completely awakened to the danger of this youth pastor the moment that she even smelled it in the room. So nobody's being thrown under the bus here. These things these things happen. So people who, we live and work with folks who, we've adopted kids who've been in traumatizing pre-adoption settings in which they weren't nurtured. And so there's the trauma of the absence of things that we need, kind of like what happens if we don't get vitamin C, we develop scurvy. And then there's trauma B, which is the form of trauma in which we actually have things that happen to us that shouldn't happen. This could be anything from single events, a car accident, a significant medical crisis. It could be something that happens, the death of a parent, a divorce. It could be a range of singular events, or it could be the ongoing course of multiple events. Like for Tara, it was in the system. And so she wasn't just, as far as her brain was concerned, she was well aware that even though it was only involving directly one person, the one person was representing a system. And so what she was pushing against was not just in her body in that moment with one person. Her mind is pushing against an entire system, which she can't do. The other way that we talk about trauma is trauma form 1, type 1 or type 2, type 1, again, referring to single events, large single events. And type 2 can be these multiple kinds of events that happen. And of course, unless they stand out in our mind as being extraordinarily heinous, we tend to not think about them as being traumatic. But, what happens if you grow up in a house where your parent is continually critical of you? And we might say, well, that's not trauma. That's growing up in this, in the Johnson's household. Except just like the bruise, the collective capacity of what that person is then having to deal with is such that they practice not paying attention to their griefs because they don't have time, effort, energy, or space in which to do it. And if you collect enough bruises on your arm, at some point, somebody walks in and it's like, dude, like, what is that? And you're like, oh, it's nothing. That's nothing. So we hear Tara's story and we're not surprised at all that this is traumatic, but we could hear a lot of our stories in which we have practiced not paying attention to the small bruises that have collectively over time taken their course and cost us dearly. And in the middle of trauma, one of the most important things that happens is the role of shame. Now, we talked about a lot of the features of shame in the book that I wrote, The Soul of Shame. But in this book, one of the primary things that we're paying attention to is this notion of isolation. Shame, in order for it to flourish, requires isolation within our hearts and between me and you. I'm going to be isolated within my mind, that part of me that doesn't want to be ashamed. Of course, Tara is not telling anyone about what's happened to her when she was in high school.
Right.
But it doesn't just separate me from the part of me that I don't like. It also separates me from you, because that means if I'm not telling you about the part of me that I'm feeling broken about, that puts more distance between you and me. And so we isolate, and we mostly isolate. We often isolate different parts of our mind, but one of the most important ways that we isolate our right brain activity from our left brain activity. And so I can become really, really good. I mean, Tara was a good student. She went to school. She got like all these kinds, like she can work really hard. And I learned to cope with my grief by just doubling down on whatever it is else in life that is real, that I'm really good at. I'm just going to work really, really hard at doing whatever the thing is that I'm really, really good at. And of course, Tara was going to be a really good parent, and she was. And this notion that we separate and we become analysts and we see that like I'm going to function out of my left brain, my logical linear, that I'm going to do all the right things, but I ignore the part of me that does the feeling and the sensing and the imaging. And the further and further they get apart, the faster they move from each other. It's like John Foreman's words from Switchfoot's song, "I'm losing ground and gaining speed." This is what we do. And we practice ignoring them, what we might call micro traumas, these micro traumatization experiences that we have in all these, like the small slights, the cuts that we have from our spouses and from our parents and from our friends and all the things. All these kinds of things that we tend to then experience in such a way that it primes us to actually just make room for more of it. And of course, if this is what we are practicing as human beings, we collectively begin to do this, and then trauma and the grief that accompanies it, powered by the shame matrix that has woven its way throughout the entire system, creates systemic trauma. And it's systemic trauma of violence. And there's nothing short of it. That violence is taking place in everything we do. We wouldn't imagine the bruise on our arm to be something of violence until you put it under the microscope. And you're like, holy crap. Like somebody just got the 4x4 and drove it right through the orchestra. And I know that as we're listening, it's possible, Pepper, that in our conversation that others are having their own stories brought to mind where perhaps they've experienced trauma in this way, their grief that has long been kept dormant. They start to sense it, feel it. For some, that grief starts to feel volcanic. It starts to feel eruptive. And, when we think about, there are 100 different ways in which trauma and grief and the shame that accompanies it shows up in our lives. In the book, and we can get to this in just a bit, we talk about why it is that sex is such a big part of this. Why do we highlight sex in this regard? And I would only say that one of the reasons why we pay so much attention to sex when it comes to trauma and grief and the shame that accompanies it is because sex is where it begins and ends. We were made male and female. We weren't made as paramecium. We were made as differentiated beings. And in being made male and female, we were being made with a vision for creativity. We were being made with a vision for beauty. And this beauty is created because a male and a female come together vulnerably. And not least of which, because our sexual organs It's not like my hands. My hands go through the day. Like, I don't have to put gloves on all the time. Like, I work in dirty dishwasher. I work in my garden. I do all kinds of things. I don't worry about that. But we would never just expose ourselves. We don't expose our sexual anatomical parts because of their vulnerability, because they are destined to be protected in order to create beauty and goodness. And that beauty and goodness and that vulnerability is fragile. And Tara was fragile. And that's the very thing that was so horribly traumatized. And this is why sexual traumatization is such a big deal. And it is there where we foist some of our most awful violence. This is where, like no other place, beauty descends and devolves into devouring, because it takes place in the most intimately relational physicality of our experience. And it is there where we visit violence upon ourselves and upon each other. The thing is that, like, the person who was the perpetrator in Tara's story, he didn't just one day show up as evil incarnate. However it was that he got to where he was by the time he found Tara and the others in the church that he abused, he'd had his own story of trauma. I don't know what it is, but you can guarantee that he'd had it, because nobody does those kinds of things without it being a reaction and response to coping with our own unresolved trauma and grief that he himself had experienced as some form of violation internally, relationally, emotionally, by someone, because this is who we are. We're not told how it is that Cain ultimately decided to kill Abel. But you can be sure that Cain felt, sensed, smelled violence in the home, because it had already happened. When Adam throws Eve under the bus in response to the wound that had been visited upon them violently by evil, we learn pretty quickly to just pass our trauma and our grief on down the line. So much so that by the time it gets to us, we're not even aware that it's not just me, it's my parents, it's my grandparents, it's generational in its nature. But the really good news about some of this, Pepper, is that we can talk about this. And as we said, like, no, this is not going to be a real feel good episode today. And I want our listeners to know that the reason that we don't flinch from this, we don't blink, we want to look trauma and grief straight in the eye. Because in Genesis chapter 2, where the gods say, let us, when the Holy Trinity says, let us make mankind in our image, we don't for a minute think they didn't know that Good Friday was coming. And still they make. And God comes right up to evil on Golgotha and says, I am willing to take all the trauma you can throw at me, and I'll absorb it and I'll extinguish it. I was just saying to a friend yesterday, like earlier in Mark's gospel, before the crucifixion, Jesus says to Peter, when Peter is so angry and he cuts off the ear of the high priest servant when they come to take him, and he says, put your sword away. Do you not know? Do you think I can't call 12 legions? That's 60,000 troops. You think I can't call them? And you think, when Jesus comes to Calvary, just like Elisha with his servant, when he asks God, show my servant the armies of the Lord. Do we think that Jesus doesn't see 60,000 angels who are at the ready. And their captain saying, you give us the word. And instead, what it's like to know that when I've got that kind of firepower waiting for me, there's not much I can't do, including asking God to forgive everybody else. Because if I need to, I know what we could do here. And Jesus says to our grief, we are not leaving you alone with it. We're coming for it. We're going to look it straight in the eye. We're going to heal it. We're going to recommission it. And in fact, it will be your grief, your trauma, that will be the very source of the creation of beauty that right now you can't even begin to imagine. This is the God that we serve.
It's great, Curt. You know, we have to, there's a whole thing of the shame that you talked about that's wrapped up in how much that integration can help wipe that clean.
Yeah.
And and how much evil doesn't want that to happen.
Right.
And how sometimes, as like you say in the book, people feel like they're going and dropping their bucket in the well over and over again, and it just keeps coming up empty as far as people that they can do this with and really trust.
Right.
And I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for our friendship and for this time together.
Yep.
Thank you. This has been a great, and thank you again for the book. I'm running out of ink as I mark it up, but it's well worth it. The Soul of Desire.
Oh, man.
Until next time, Curt.
Until next time. Looking forward to it. Love you, man.
You too.
Whew. Okay, a story came to mind, and I may have shared this before. So I played basketball in high school, and the star of the basketball team was Dana LaBeouf, and she was fabulous. And I remember during practice, she would say, Amy, and when we would practice free throws, I would just always feed it to other people. And she came up to me and she said, Amy, practice them, because in one time in the game, it's going to matter. And if you haven't practiced, guess what's going to happen? So if Dana LaBeouf told me to do anything, I would do it. So I practiced. And then I'm sure you can see where this is going. So then when there was a game, it was a I got fouled. They intentionally fouled me, which I'm not going to think about why they fouled me. They probably thought I wouldn't make the free throw. So I'm at the free throw line and I make it, and it mattered. And I'm like, yes. I'm like, Dana. And as you guys were talking, it was like, okay, in trauma and traumatic experiences, those are hard to talk about sometimes. And then I think, okay, it's in our daily grief that we get to practice acknowledging those, so that when it really matters, and it all matters, but then we know how to talk about it.
Yeah.
And it's the fountain pen. I was laughing with friends, this was a while ago. I don't even remember how it came up, but I said, I experience grief at the bottom of every milkshake. Oh my gosh, it's over.
This is what grief sounds like to Amy.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
That's awesome.
And
I love
I
that.
don't gather my friends together and say, I really need to talk about it 'cause today I had a milkshake and it came to an end. But I could say at the end of my milkshake, oh my gosh, I'm so sad it's gone.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Kelly Corrigan, in her book "Tell Me More," she talks about the loss of her dad, and her dad lived. She was in her 50s, when her dad died, and the amount of grief she was so overwhelmed with. And I think it's going to sound kind of weird, but I think, when I die, like that's the goal. I want my kids and I want to have loved so well that no matter how long I'm here, that,
yeah. Well, and that you're putting your finger on something that is a crucial, like it can be kind of like it's subtle, but it's a really crucial difference between unresolved grief and the kind of grief you're talking about. Like there is a sense in which it's like Paul when he writes in 2 Corinthians 7:10, where he says there is a godly grief that leads to repentance, and there is an ungodly grief that leads to death. This notion that Tara's story, I mean, it's, not to be too overly dramatic, but Tara's story was one of grief with no repentance. It was not like, I don't mean her grief, but I mean like, there's like, it's loss of something that she should never have lost.
Right.
Our kids are going to lose us. And like, but I remember my friend Steve, when my mother passed away and I was having to drive out of town to go kind of be with her for the last couple of days that she was going to be alive. And she was 86. My friend Steve said, even if you're 86, Curt, it's just not the way it's supposed to be. And I've been around death since I was 3 years old because of where I ended up in my sequence of things, right? All these people dying because older people. And it's just like this is just what happens. And you just kind of get used to it. And when Steve said that, it felt like, oh my gosh. Somebody said something for the first time that like sounds it's exactly right. That's exactly right. It's not the way it should be. When your kids experience grief, the grief is not going to be because of trauma you've caused, but the very opposite. We can experience grief in the wake of trauma, in the wake of loss of that kind. But when we lose something that is a representation of life and beauty and goodness, that kind of grief is a longing for heaven. It's not just, I'm trying to buffer something heinous that happened to me. That's longing for heaven right there. Right? Like that dog will hunt.
That's Charlie Brown grief.
That's right.
That's good grief.
It's good grief. That's right. That's right. I hope we're holding on to these phrases because this is what we're going to, the transition, at some point, we really are going to want to come back to this chapter because that's what we try to do in the rest of the book, right? We're letting this sit with people in order to then usher them into this space of now what do we do?
Right.
Yeah.
Great.
I think I'm going to have a milkshake today.
I think you need to. And here's the thing. Just don't finish it.
Yeah.
Just don't finish it. Just, leave just a little bit left, put it in the freezer. Come back tomorrow and have a sip.
Maybe buy a bigger milkshake.
Yeah, buy a big
Get
milkshake.
the large.
Yeah, that's a good
Get the
idea.
large.
Get the large. That's right. get the large. And like, what's that thing? If like, if you, when you were a kid and they said, okay, if you had to cross the room and you could travel halfway across the room and then you went halfway, you'd never get to the end of the room. Right. So that's what we'll do. We'll get you the large milkshake. You drink half, then you just only sequentially only ever drink half of what's left in the milkshake.
I'll never reach the bottom.
It'll be like Elijah and that woman who like didn't have any flour in her bin and she's just going to go off and die. Right. And he's like, just flour just keeps coming. Uh-huh. I like that.
If you look at the bottom of that milkshake under a microscope, you can see nothing but carnage.
Milkshake carnage.
Oh my gosh.
I did love that analogy though, Curt, when you were talking about the bruise and how, like if you look at it up close, it's done some major damage in there. It's carnage, right? But because everything else is kind of okay, you don't pay attention to it. It's, with all these little traumas and griefs that we just ignore and don't talk about.
Yeah.
So is there something we can do this week besides get a milkshake? Is there something our listeners can do?
An application?
This week? Yeah.
While he's thinking.
Yeah.
I'm very fond of the beard. What do you think, Amy? The beard? Doesn't it look
Always.
good?
Yes.
No, he's really got a nice, you've got a...
My beard?
Yeah. It's
really
good. Yeah.
Oh, is
it's
it really?
Not mine. I hope it's not mine.
Well, he just said the beard. I'm like, I didn't know. Were you talking about somebody else's? I know it.
No,
Amy, I know he wasn't talking about your beard. But I'm like, wait.
Yeah.
Do you have it? I'm thinking like, does Pep have it? No, Pep doesn't have a beard. Like, I'm like, oh, this beard. It's funny. It's due for a trim. I keep it clipped pretty. And now, like, it's 85, 90% gray.
Looks good.
I vote no trim.
No, oh really? Okay.
Duck Dynasty, baby. Yeah.
No, let's not go that far.
Wait, what's that? I don't know what that is.
Like a ZZ Top beard, a real
Duck
long.
Dynasty,
Let's don't do that. But I think you should let it come in a little bit. I think it looks great.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, I'll keep that in mind. Okay. Here's just some vanity for our listeners.
Yes.
This morning, like 5 minutes before I get on the air with you guys, I'm in the bathroom with the tweezers. It's like the beard is going gray. I've got gray here around the ear a little bit, but and I got, a little bit in my hair, but for the most part, it's not. But my eyebrows are still almost coal black, with the exception of the 4 garden hose size gray hairs that are growing out of each side that look like spikes that are coming out. And you can see them so I'm with the tweezers 5 minutes ahead because I'm pulling these things out. I'm like, why can't they all just come in gray all at once so that I don't have any option? I'm just gonna have to live with it. Instead, it tempts me to think that I can maintain the dark appearance, and there I am,
I think it's worthy work. It's okay to pluck those.
Nobody wants salt and pepper eyebrows.
Oh my gosh, it's the worst. And then I've got these a harvest of 8 not gray, they're white. They're white eyebrow hairs in my hand. I wonder if I can sell these things to somebody. I don't know. Do you need white eyebrows?
So
Margaret.
This week's application.
Yeah.
Grab a tweezer.
That's right. The grief of losing my dark brown hair, my black eyebrows.
Yes.
Caramba. I don't know. Okay. Well, I mean, part of the reason why we just kind of move on from grief is because we collect it and it just gets too much. Mm-hmm. And so I would say, an exercise would be, I want you to, I would want our listeners to make a list of at least 3 griefs that you can measure. And by measure, I mean that have application to you personally. So you might say, it's a grief to me what happened in Afghanistan. We're not minimizing that, but I'm really talking about your own personal experience of loss. Can you name 3 of those things? And can you name what you feel? What were the circumstances around the loss? And then I would also, like, part 2 would be, what have you done in response to that? What have you done? Have you told anyone? Do you just go exercise more? Do you pretend it doesn't happen? It hasn't happened. Do you, the exercise looks like it's constructive, right? So that's that, and it may be to some degree, but am I exercising as a way to not pay attention to that? Or do I go the other direction and I move into a more kind of obviously destructive addiction pattern? Am I looking at things I shouldn't look at? Am I drinking too much alcohol? Am I, I don't know. There's all kinds of things that we do that are destructive. And then the last thing would be of this practice would be, I want you to tell somebody. I want you to go, who's going to be the person that you're going to like, I want you to, here are the 3 things I'm going to tell you about my 3 griefs. Now that's what I'm coming up with at the moment.
I think that's great.
It's great. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's great.
Doable and helpful.
This podcast is produced by Curt Thompson, Pepper Sweeney, and myself, Amy Chella. Audio production and editing is by Keaton Simons. Video production and editing is done by Mark Gould. If you'd like to connect with us, you can find us on social media at BeingKnownPod. If you like this podcast, tell a friend. If you love this podcast, tell everyone you know. And please like, rate, and review wherever you listen. Be well. Be known.